To prepare for Lab 7, I want to talk about two different ideas for generating a series of numeric values using a for loop. Okay. Now, so far, when we've looked at loops, and especially for loops, we've only seen one way to do this. Okay, so here's an example problem. Oh, let me explain. What we have is the control variable of the for loop. Now, that's a term that I like to use to describe, it's the variable that we are testing in the for loop condition, the Boolean expression, to see whether or not we want to stay in the loop or whether we want to exit the loop. So whatever variable we are testing, that's what I call the control variable of the for loop. And so in this particular example, the control variable of the loop contains the values that we want to process, either print or use in a calculation, something like that. So here's an example. If I asked you to write a for loop that would print the odd numbers between 100 and 200 on separate lines in the Java console. Okay, well, separate lines in the Java console, that should immediately bring system out println to your mind. Okay, so we'll have that inside the loop. And then the variable that's controlling the for loop could contain those numbers. Okay, so here's an example for loop where, now see, num is the variable that we're testing here in this Boolean expression. So that's what I call the control variable for the loop. So notice that we initialize num with the first odd number between between 100 and 200. That would be 101. Okay, and once we've processed an odd number, what's the next odd number that we'd want to do? Well, we want to add 2. So we would add 2 to the number. And we keep going as long as num is less than or equal to 200, because if num is less than or equal to 200, we haven't printed them all yet. But if num gets bigger than 200, then we have printed all the ones from 100 to 200. So do you see how this would work? That makes sense, probably, hopefully. But what I'm saying is that the control variable for the loop contains the value to be processed. Okay, so that strategy works well if you know the first and last values in the sequence to be processed. I said we wanted all of the odd numbers between 100 and 200. So we know the first one is 101. We know the last one is 199. Okay, and how the values change from one to the next. So once you've processed an odd number, the next odd number that you want to process is 2 more than the current value. Okay, but this doesn't work well if you don't know the first and last values in the sequence. If instead you want a specific number of lines or specific number of values to be processed in a particular sequence. Okay, so here's an example. What if I asked you to print out the first 47 multiples of 7 that are greater than or equal to 700 on separate lines in the Java console? Okay, you see how that's different than the other problem? Here I'm giving you a specific count of the number of values that I want to process in a sequence starting with a particular value. Okay, so we know what the starting value is. The first greater than or equal to 700. Well, 700 is a multiple of 7, right? And we know that the next multiple of 7 would be 7 more than the previous one. So 700, then 707, then 714. Those are all multiples of 7. Okay. Well, what's the 47th one? What's the 47th multiple of 7 that's greater than or equal to 700? I don't know. Okay. So that makes this a different kind of problem. So in a situation like this, where you don't specifically know the starting and ending values that you want, there's a different approach we can use to write the for loop that will generate a specific number of values in a series of numeric values. Okay, and so that second approach would be the control variable for the loop does not contain the values in the series to be processed, or the sequence to be processed. The control variable is going to count how many times we have gone through the loop. That's called a loop iteration. So each trip through the loop is called a loop iteration, and our control variable is going to be counting how many times we have gone through the loop. And then we'll use a second separate variable that will contain the values for the sequence. Okay, so here's a code for that second example. If I want to print out the first 47 multiples of 7 that are greater than or equal to 700. Okay, I have two integer variables. Let me do this. Okay, so I have a variable called num, which is containing the value to be printed. See that? So I'm printing num. Num's going to start at 700 because I know that's the first value I wanted. But notice that the control variable for the for loop is not num, it's count. So I have two different variables. Count is, the only purpose of count is it's keeping track of how many times I've gone through the loop. So if I initialize count to 1 here inside the for loop heading, and then I'm going to keep going as long as count is less than or equal to 47, because if count is less than or equal to 47, I haven't executed the loop 47 times yet. And then, so if count is less than or equal to 47, I stay in the loop. What do? I print the value of num, but then I also have to update the num so that it is the next multiple of 7 the next time I go around through here and print it. So after I print the current value of num, the new value of num should be the old value of num plus 7. Right? And then I go back up here and add 1 to count, and I go back and do the test again. So every time I add 1 to count, that's one more time I'm going to potentially go through the loop, and I will only go through 47 times. Okay? So you see the difference between that and the other example. Okay, so the other example, the control variable for the loop is what was also being processed inside the loop. Here, the control variable for the loop is a different variable from the value being processed. So, just to summarize, there's two problem types, and you can have two styles of code for this. So if you know the starting and ending values in a sequence, it might be hard to calculate how many values there are in that sequence. Okay, print out all the multiples of 37 between 1,000 and 3,000. Well, I don't know how many there are. Okay, you'd have to figure it out somehow. So but I know the starting and ending values. Then, in that case, the control variable, the easy way to write the for loop is that the loop control variable should contain the data values that are to be processed. However, if you know how many values you want, it might be hard to calculate what the last value is for the sequence, as we saw with that multiples of 7, the first 47 multiples of 7 or whatever. Okay, so in that case, the loop control variable counts how many times we go through the loop, and extra variables are used to store the data values you are generating and processing. So Lab 7 is going to use this second approach, and that's why we wanted to record this video, so that you could have that idea as a lead-in for working on Lab 7. Okay, so have fun with for loops in Lab 7 and future assignments.